Good afternoon for those of you that are just joining us. Again, I'll just kind of remind everybody to keep yourself on mute during this presentation, and if you could shut off your video, that will make sure that our recording of this captures my talking during this time period, and then we can have you guys turn your videos back on and audio back on when we get to the Q&A section. So again, just mute yourself and shut off your cameras, and we will get rolling. So for those of you who I may not have met before, my name is Katie Anderson. I am one of the founders of Aperion Management Group. And our goal today, we're going to be going through sort of our Board 101 class. If you've attended some of our other training, there might have been a little bit more specifics when we go over rulemaking or financials. This one is really driven towards what is the structure of a video, what is a structure of a board, and what is their purpose? How is an association structured? And really, what's your overarching goals and where do some of your authorities come from? And so we're going to go through that information today. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of what it means for you to serve as a board member in one of your communities or as a volunteer in one of your communities. So, you'll see we use some funny comics throughout our presentation because sometimes our work is hard and we like to lighten it up a little bit. So, one of our goals as a management company, as a consultant, as someone who interacts in your community is to make sure that we're helping your organization, your board of directors run in such a manner that your board doesn't feel like they have to hide from their neighbors or be concerned about walking the neighborhood if you're serving on the board. So it's funny, but not necessarily what we want for your community. So we're going to dive in first and foremost and chat about what is the purpose of a community association. It seems kind of simplistic to talk about this in this term, but for community associations, at the heart of why they're established is to create community. You are running a business and you are governing that development. So whether you're a condo or a single family development, this structure looks the same regardless of what your community looks like. You are going to, as a board, be focusing your efforts in these three key areas. And there's going to be a lot of tasks and obligations that come with that. But ultimately, the goal for an association is to create community, to run it like a business, and to govern based off of your documents. So what are the types of communities? Because we do get this question a lot. What is my community? And just strictly, if you were to stand in front of your home and look at it, it wouldn't necessarily tell you what your community is or what the governing structure of it. So what you see here on the screen is what would generally be categorized more of a single family dwelling, or we also call those planned unit developments. And a planned unit development is a community that's formed under Chapter 94 in the state of Oregon statutes. And what that says, the definition sort of a planned unit development, is that the owner owns the lot and the unit, which is also could be a home, and the community owns the common area. The interesting part about this is you can also have a planned unit community that looks sort of like a condo. You could have it attached structures. You could have it in sort of a townhome fashion. So just because the product is attached doesn't mean that it would automatically not be a planned community. That's where we go back to the documents and take a look at it and say, what is it defined? What's the legal definition when the community was formed? But generally speaking, a planned community in Oregon tends to look like a single family dwelling. And they're on your documents, it's going to tell you that. Are you subject to Chapter 94 as a planned community? Or are you subject to Chapter 100, which is condominium statute? And a condominium statute is, a condominium as it's defined is slightly different in that the owner essentially owns the airspace. Sometimes you'll hear it said from the studs in, from the finished surface in, from the drywall in, but it's essentially from a boundary of that unit inward. And the association as a corporation then has the responsibility for that portion out, and every owner has an undivided interest in what is then owned by the corporation. So in condominiums, you'll usually see assessments are sometimes calculated based off of percentage, that sort of calculated of square footage, things of that nature. So you have two types of communities that are governed under the state and the state of Oregon, and that is a planned community and a condominium. And when we look outside of Oregon, there are other types of associations, but these are the two most common in our state. You may also see things like cooperatives. These are big in New York, other larger cities. We do have what is master associations in Oregon, not as many of them, but we do have them. And what a master association is that you typically have sort of an overall governing association that might have sub-communities underneath them. This is generally representative of really large communities or communities that might have different product types, and you want to have them with a different set of rules. So you may have a master association that has a couple of condos, you might have an apartment community in there, and then you might have single family dwellings. And so the master association is set up to govern globally, and then the sub-associations might have different sets of documents. And then a mixed use could be where you might have one type of product, but you might have different uses. You might have commercial, you might have residential. And then you have a 55 and older community, which are generally deed restricted, that you have to be of that age or have someone in your household that is over those age. We don't see as many of these product types in Central Oregon or even really in Oregon, but they are part of what sort of makes up the body of community associations. And I should mention, if you have questions as I go through the presentation, please feel free to use the chat function at the top. Go ahead and type them in. I am monitoring that, and I can answer questions as we go through this presentation. So where do the obligations of an association come from? So if you're on the board or you're serving as a volunteer, how do you know what you're supposed to do? Where do we as management go to make sure that we understand what you're obligated to do as we guide and consult with you through some of these challenges? So there's sort of 4 key areas that we look at in the documents to establish where those sources of obligation come from, and ultimately give the board some guidance on what their path looks like for that running that business. So you have your federal, state, local ordinances that govern the structure of how a community is established and set out what a community is obligated to do. You have your governing documents, and those governing documents can, it makes up a whole package. And we're going to go through what are some of those documents and what's the hierarchy of those documents. We look to our professional obligations, both here in our state, but also at a national level. What are best practices in our industry when we're making those recommendations to the board on your obligations? And then there are some communities that, have specific lender requirements. So for example, you might have something in your governing documents that requires a certain level of notice to a mortgagee if you're going to be making substantial changes to your governing documents. So there are multiple different sources that we look at when we start to examine what's the obligation for a community, what are they responsible for? And then through that lens is the recommendations or the guidance or the support that we then provide to the board of directors. So when it comes to your governing documents and sort of how that plays into how you structure and run as a board of directors, this hierarchy is an important thing to understand, because you can't, if something is in conflict, we need to know what takes precedence. Federal statute, there's not a lot of them that govern community association, but there are a few that boards should be aware of. The sort of most common one that comes up that you'll hear acronym, which is called OTARD, or over-the-air devices, that governs literally people's right to obtain satellite television services and dictates how the association may establish rules that could potentially restrict their access to that. It has been law probably going on 20 years now, and it is probably the one piece of federal legislation that really, no matter what your governing documents say, no matter what state statute says, it sort of overwrote all of that. So you can place some reasonable restrictions on it, but we can't prevent people from getting satellite dishes and placement. So we can work on color, placement, those types of things. And then state statutes would be next. A few other federal statutes, sorry, I didn't cover those, but a few other federal statutes that are important to understand is the freedom to fly a flag. That protects people's right to fly an American flag. Doesn't protect if they want to put up their college alma mater or those types of things, but it does protect their right to fly a flag. And then the other two that we pay close attention to is the fair housing regulations and the fair debt collection. And fair debt collection comes into play just, as you would assume, in the collection of assessments and fees. We have to make sure that we are being compliant with that. And fair housing comes into play in a couple of different scenarios to make sure that you are being mindful of protected classes. And these issues from a federal perspective don't come up all that often in community associations, but our managers are trained to understand when some of those triggers might occur and when you may need to bring in some legal counsel and get some extended advice on that, because fair housing is complex and we're not experts on it, but we certainly have attorneys that are. Our state statutes, there are a couple of chapters that we familiarize our boards with and make them knowledgeable as to how that governs. So as I mentioned earlier, you have Chapter 94, which is your Planned Community Act. You have Chapter 100, which is your condominium regulations. And then we also pull some guidance and are responsible to comply with the Nonprofit Act in Oregon, which is Chapter 65. And those three chapters of the overall state statutes govern a lot of what we do here in Oregon. And that establishes how communities are formed. And then you get down into more specific documents that are unique to your community. Your Articles of Incorporation is what forms your community. That's filed with the Secretary of State and incorporates you as a business in Oregon. Sometimes those Articles of Incorporation are very simple documents and just simply say, here's the name and here's the mailing address, etc., for that organization. Other times there's things in that Articles of Incorporation on how the corporation will be carried out too. Kind of depends on who the attorney was that formed it and how they wrote those documents. Then you have your governing documents, and your governing documents, sometimes we refer to them as CC&Rs. They could be a declaration. It depends on, again, what the attorney decided when they were drafting those documents. But your governing documents then establish what the association is responsible for, how assessments are going to be calculated, things, architectural review, structure is going to be in your governing documents. And then your bylaws are subordinate to your declaration, CC&Rs, or governing documents. And your bylaws are going to be more of the business. How many people are on your board? How often are you having meetings? When do those meetings have to be noticed? So the bylaws are going to contain a little bit more of the business functionality of the organization. The governing documents are going to really establish what the organization is responsible for. And then you're going to have any policies, rules, regulations, resolutions that the board may approve, adopt, or put in place that are in line with the governing documents. So for example, what's important for boards to understand is you can't develop a rule that is going to conflict in language with your governing documents unless there's some authority that gives you the ability to do so. So for example, if you had maintenance responsibility that's noted in your governing documents, but it gives the board of directors the ability to expand upon that, you could adopt a resolution that expands upon those maintenance responsibilities. But you couldn't, for example, if your community doesn't have a rental restriction or has a rental restriction in your governing documents that you don't like, you couldn't adopt a resolution that changed the wording of that without a vote of the owners or a modification to your governing documents. Some commonly used terms that you'll hear our managers, our staff use, these aren't all of them, but these are a handful of them. Articles of incorporation explain that. CC&Rs and declaration, we use them kind of interchangeable, depends on what yours are called. Community restrictions and rules. Some of your restrictions are going to be found in your governing documents, and some of them may be resolutions and rules that you expand upon. Your plat is part of your governing documents, and your plat is, if you're a condominium, that your plat's going to tell you what the boundary is of that condominium and who's responsible for what. If you're a planned unit development, that plat is going to show you what the lots layout is. It's going to tell you what the common tracts are for a community. Those common tracts are going to tie to the county's tax system. So the plat is an important piece to understand, and your bylaws and your governing documents. So these are all going to be words you're going to hear us use sort of somewhat interchangeably in our interactions with you as board members. So these documents lay out a couple of pieces of information, like what is the board responsible for? And when you read through some of these governing documents, at times it can be a little bit scary to serve on a board of directors. Do I want to be responsible for making these decisions with my neighbors? And what if my neighbors don't like something that I say or do? And one thing that's important that we like to share with our boards is this concept of what is fiduciary duty? What is the business judgment rule? And how does that all work? Because as you go about serving on the board, from time to time, you're going to get individuals that are going to come forward and ask the board for something, and the board may have to tell them no. And that's generally where conflict arises. Either when we're telling an owner you can't do something you want to do, or you're making a decision on design review that they disagree with. Those are where the conflicts arise in communities. And so for boards, it's important for you to understand what your charge is as a board member. So what you're responsible to do for the corporation that you're serving on is to act in good faith, to make sure that you are making decisions based off of recommendations from your experts, and you have the ability to rely on those recommendations. So as a management company, we're one of your experts, your landscaping company, your insurance brokers, your attorneys. These are all experts that you as board members get to rely on. And what the general rule of thumb is when it comes to disputes or disagreements is that as long as the board is carrying out their responsibilities and obligations in accordance with that fiduciary duty or business judgment, the courts are going to rely on the fact that you carried it out to the best of your ability. They're not going to go back and sort of revisit if the information was different. Could you have made a different decision? They're going to, be concerned. Did the board seek advice? And did they rely on that advice? Or did they maybe make a decision without all of that information? And then the courts may question potentially, the decision that the board made. But in most instances, in the 20 years I've been doing this, when there's been disputes, and sometimes that rises to legal disputes for communities, so long as the board is following this process, what that then means is you're indemnified as a board. You are protected through your directors and officers insurance. And so serving on this board, serving in the capacity of running this corporation, you aren't personally held liable as an individual. And so these are important things to understand. And the key to this is making sure that the confidentiality that you hold as a board member is maintained, and that if you have any conflicts of interest, that you make sure that you disclose them. The board has a chance to chat about it and then decide how to move forward with it. And so, occasionally it's somewhat still a small town. Occasionally this comes up when you have, a board member that may have expertise in a certain area, has some background in landscaping, for example. So they may bring in someone that they know to provide a quote for those services. It's always good to disclose to your other board members what those relationships may be, so that later on, if they're, sort of found out, there's not any concern that that wasn't known when a board made a decision. And these legal charges, don't get too hung up on them. Our intention isn't to scare you as board members. It's more so to make sure that you understand how we approach this with the boards, and make sure that you kind of keep that reasonable standard in your mind as you go about the business of communities. And yes, the legal charge applies to subcommittees. So for your architectural review, if you've got a landscape committee, for example, your directors and officers insurance covers your committees, and your committee is responsible for making decisions in the same manner. So all that applies across the board. So from the day-to-day perspective, how do we distill down what those obligations are and how we go about carrying out the business of communities? So if you were to sit down and read your governing documents, your CC&Rs, your declaration, whatever it's called for your community, there's going to be a long list of powers and obligations. Most of it talks about what the board of directors is responsible for. And occasionally we'll have a new board member that'll actually sit down and read the document, and then we'll come into a meeting and say, wait, I don't want to take on the role of the treasurer because it says I have to do all of these things, which is accurate. If you sat down and you read your governing documents, it's going to tell, it's going to lay out that the powers of the board is to maintain the community, to collect assessments, to make sure that you're assessing the owners and enforcing the CC&Rs, and that you are keeping a roster of your owners' current addresses and all of these things. So if you sat down and you read all of these things and you're on the board, that would be a full-time job. No way would we get board members to sign up for that. And so that's generally where we come in that the board has the ability to contract away those obligations. It doesn't mean that you as a board member are physically going out and carrying out that work. What it means is you as a board member are making sure that that work is happening. And so some of these things that are on the screen aren't things that you as individual board members are doing. It's going to be things that either we are doing, or you have another contractor, you have a maintenance contractor, you have a landscape vendor, you have a CPA, you have a lot of different individuals that you're engaging for those services. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your board is the one that is physically carrying out this work. So the day-to-day may look a little different depending upon the structure of your community, what work is involved for your community, and how much time in engagement is necessary for that. But this is a generalized list. Feel free to visit your governing documents and take a look at specifically what it says for your community. But this is generally what that list is going to look like. So as I said, then how do you take those obligations and distill that down to make sure that you as a board are meeting those obligations? And a good portion of that work is what we as a management company do for you. And so, we hope that you as a board member aren't receiving daily phone calls or emails from your membership. That is our manager's role. That's how that kind of flows. But in most instances, this is what the general scope of service is for our management agreement, and how the boards for our communities carry out meeting their obligations. So again, you've got statutes and federal laws that sort of say how a community is formed. Then you have your individual documents that form that community. You're now serving on that. So how do we make sure that we're complying with that? And this is that process for how we distill those obligations down into those specific roles. So how does that work flow? How do we make sure that those expectations are getting taken care of, and sort of who does what? What pieces, if the board is contracting away your obligations, what pieces does the board still have responsibility for? And what do we as management take over? And so for board, it's important to understand there are certain things that you can't contract away. You can't contract away your responsibility to create rules and policies, because as management, we don't make decisions. We give you recommendations, we do the research, we do due diligence, we take care of a lot of pieces, but we don't make decisions. So the board can't contract away their responsibility to make those decisions unless you want to hire an attorney to be a conservator for you and make all of them for you. But that piece of it still rests with the board of directors. So you create rules and policies, you're going to approve budgets and establish assessments. You've all been doing that over the last, couple of weeks or coming up. You're going to be making sure that you're complying with the laws and ordinances. You're going to be approving vendor contracts. You're going to be directing our managers on how we're communicating with the ownership, what you want communicated with the ownership, and running the association like a business. And then that day-to-day process of organizing meetings and sending out physical bills, paying your contractors, overseeing maintenance contractors, communicating with your ownership, emails, phone calls, all of those things, that's what our managers are going to be doing. And so the communication flows from your ownership to our managers, and then from our managers up to you guys. Occasionally, there's going to be instances where ownership, has an issue and they want to talk directly to the board. That generally happens at a meeting. That doesn't generally happen, outside of that open meeting. So how do we align all of these expectations? How do we make sure that the board understands what we're doing, that the ownership understands what we're doing, the ownership understands what the board is doing, and sort of all of these various pieces? And I think, it's important to understand that as a community association, you are going to touch a lot of different things. You are going to, you might have pools and roads, and you might be responsible for townhomes that have roofs and siding and painting and landscaping and various other things. You might have parks and trails and all of those, individual things. You're not responsible as a board member to be an expert in all of those areas. Not even our managers are going to be experts in all of those areas. They're going to be generalists, and then they're going to bring you resources from experts when that's necessary. And so sometimes it's important for board members to understand, so you can make sure that that gets communicated to the ownership through how you're running the community, that, you're all in this together. As this comic on the screen says, who does a HOA think that they are? Well, it says here that we're the HOA. So if one individual decides, we're going to take action against the association, they're essentially taking action against themselves. And so a lot can be accomplished by having conversations and discussing, mediating. That avoids some of these more tense and contentious problems. But essentially understand there is going to be a lot of things that could come up for your community. And it isn't the expectation that you are experts in all of those areas. That's what we bring to the table for you guys, is to help give you that information from those that are experts. So, what do our managers do? Some of that you saw earlier, but our managers are serving as single points of contact. We are maintaining standards for you. And it's important that, as a board of directors, that you understand some of the things that are in our contract. So if you haven't ever sat down and read our contract, reach out to our manager. We can, send you a copy of this. But this is also a distilled list of things that are obligations within our contract that says, you as board members, these are the things that you're agreeing in interacting with our company. That you are agreeing to a single point of contact. And why do we ask for a single point of contact? So think about it from this perspective. If you have a 5-member board and you are meeting quarterly and decisions are being made, and something comes up and suddenly the manager has 5 different individuals sending them emails saying, can you take care of this? Can you go do this? We want you to do this. That would then create a little bit of chaos for our manager to try and distill what's the priority, or do we have consensus on this? So the one point of contact is really for best practice operations for our communities, but also efficiency for our managers. Generally, that single point of contact is the president, but not always. Sometimes your president doesn't have the time for that. And so the board will need to decide who that single point of contact is. And that single point of contact's responsibility is that our manager is going to be communicating with them, and they're going to be pushing that information, then the necessary information, out to the other board members. It might be something as simple as, we need to send an owner communication. Here are my thoughts. I want to do this, this, and this. Our manager and the board president may have that conversation. Yep, go ahead and draft this and send it off to the board. That then allows for business to keep moving in between board meetings, but it also means that we sort of take that direction and distill it in a pretty efficient manner. Maintaining high standards of conduct and respecting our manager's personal time. We work really hard to try and make sure that we respect your personal time and that our managers have a balanced life outside of their job. That's important to us. Attend board meetings. It doesn't mean you can't miss a board meeting, but it does mean that if you're not going to be available, that you make sure and let our managers know. We try and set the schedule a year in advance for most of our communities and give you an opportunity to set those calendar dates so you can work around them. Mutual respect. This is a hard one right now. I would say this extends to your ownership. And, just make sure that if there is conflict, that we all approach it in a civil manner and that we're able to treat each other with respect and no name calling or curse words. You'd be surprised about some of the communication we receive. Use of Robert's Rules of Order. When we send this presentation out today, I will send you guys also a really quick cheat sheet on how to use Robert's Rules of Order. It's not nearly as scary as it sounds. You don't have to be an expert parliamentarian to conduct a meeting. It's really just a matter of understanding, how motions are called, when that process is used. It helps to control meetings, especially if you've got a fairly engaged ownership who maybe want input into the meeting. Sometimes it's a good tool to make sure that your meetings don't run for 3 hours. Prepare for your meetings. Our managers are sending your board packets out. Read them. Don't be opening the email and the PDF for the first time when you're sitting down in that chair for that meeting. There's a lot of effort and energy that goes into making sure that the information is available to you before the meeting. So make sure you're reading it. And attend your annual training. So all of you got to kind of check this off of the list, but this is one of the things in our contract for you to attend annual training. So thank you for joining us today. And in our management agreement, these are the things aside from the scope of work that we commit to for our boards, that we are going to host these trainings, that we're going to make sure that you as board members have the opportunity to be trained, to ask questions, to understand your obligations and how to run an association effectively and efficiently. We're going to require that our managers are, treating our boards and community members with respect, vendors with respect. We're going to make sure we're prepared for your board meetings, that we're participating in best practices, constantly looking for ways to be more transparent and provide information out to your community members. All of our managers are educated professionals. They're engaging in our industry, in our trainings, in our standards, and making sure that they can provide the best service to your boards. And, hopefully we can get back to a place where we are helping communities plan some social events and engage in community building. I think we all miss that to some regard. Last year, when we were working with our managers in some of our communities, we asked our managers, if there were a few things that you could tell your board of directors that you could hope that they would know, what are some of those things? And that from that conversation came this list of things that, our managers hope that you as board members know. So we chose to put this into our board training because we want to make sure that you understand the perspective which we approach these relationships from, and that, we work as your partner. I think as a company, as an organization, we work well with boards that see us as those partners, not as sort of an individual who might just be a taskmaster. We're here to provide expertise and oversight to our boards and our communities, and to help protect you. We've had board members joke over the years that our job was to keep them out of court, and that's where our advice comes from. Our advice comes from understanding case law, from understanding industry best practice. If you guys are going to make a decision that could potentially get you in trouble, we're going to tell you that. You might not like it. Occasionally you might not like it, and we totally respect that. But our managers are going to come from that perspective of trying to make sure that you as individuals are protected, and the community is ran like a corporation. And I would say, it's always helpful for our managers to know your communication preference. If you are, your email is just overloaded and it's hard for you to keep up on that, but they need a response from you, and text messages might be better, or a phone call or things like that, give our managers a heads up. Understanding your communication preferences is helpful in getting out of you what we need to do our jobs too. And, kudos and constructive feedback is always welcome. Sometimes boards feel like they have to wait for a board meeting or for something of that nature to have a conversation, about something that they might be concerned about. Call your manager up, have that conversation with them. We're not perfect. We're going to make mistakes, and, give our managers the opportunity to have that conversation and dialogue, but also tell them when they've done something good. Occasionally, those kudos are hard to come by sometimes in our communities. So as board members, if we're doing something right, tell your manager. And owners have an obligation as well. They have an obligation to be engaged, to stay informed. And that means, coming to board meetings, reading the information that's coming out. It's always hard sitting on the board seat, because you're going to have neighbors that, why did assessments go up, or why are you doing this? And you're holding meetings that all of your members have the ability to come and listen to the debate and dialogue and engage in that, which would definitely make your job easier as a board and our job easier as managers. But they won't. And then they'll, fire off emails or rile up their neighborhood and things like that. And so it's okay for you as board members to push back on them and say that they have an obligation to get engaged and to stay informed. They have a responsibility to pay their assessments, and to make sure that they're treating board, neighbors, staff with kindness and respect. That's very important. So what does running a business, if you sort of distill those three things from earlier in the presentation of community and business and governance, what are some of those buckets that we oversee as a board? You're taking those obligations and making sure that the decisions that you're making are effectively carrying out the charge of this corporation. So you are setting rules, overseeing financials, you're running effective meetings, you're making sure that you're doing it legally, and you're communicating with your ownership on that. And, we have a separate, for those of you who may not have participated, we have separate trainings for our rulemaking and policy making to really drill into how you make policies for a community. We have a separate training for financials. You don't have to be a financial expert, but we like our boards to understand how to read them. And coming in January, we'll actually have a separate separate training for running effective meetings, and really drill down into how to use Robert's Rules of Order, how do all those pieces work. But these are sort of the buckets for a community within the decision making that the board is going to be involved in, engaged in, and areas of important knowledge base for you as an individual. Communication, communication, it's always interesting. Sometimes you'll go to a meeting and, prepare a presentation. Here's what we did this last year. Here's all the projects that we did. And you'll have those owners that say, but, communication is tougher. I'm not getting, what I need from the community for communication. I always follow up that comment with, how is it that you'd prefer to be communicated with? Because occasionally that means, sometimes they want to hear it from the board. Our managers are sending out emails or newsletters or things like that. It's amazing sometimes what you can do by putting, from the president at the bottom of a letter versus from the manager. But also, how does the communication flow in these formats? Owner to owner, board member to owner, board to manager, board to board. So it's important to understand, and we say this a lot, but board to board communication outside of a board meeting cannot happen by email. If you are sending emails and you're replying all to your board members, you're violating the open meetings law in Oregon. So how does the board communicate when, you have those restrictions? Because the open meeting law in Oregon is developed to say that every owner has the ability to listen to the debate and the discussion about an issue. And so between board meetings, you can't have board members emailing each other, or you're violating that opportunity for your ownership. So if you have stuff that needs to happen in between board meetings, the best thing to do is we have our managers send out an issue summary and say, this is the decision that we make, and the response back goes directly to our manager. If you have, something you need to talk about, one board member can call up another board member, but you can't convene a quorum of the board in a discussion, or you're violating the open meetings law. And, board to manager, again, make sure you have that, who is that point of contact for your community, and how are they communicating those things to the board, to the manager. And what that means is you might have board members that are sending things to that individual contact saying, can we add this to the agenda? Can we chat about this? What's going on with this? And then that communication is distilled and sent to the manager. But again, trying to avoid that communication coming from 3, 5, 7. We have some boards that have 9 people on them. So we can't have all of those individuals corresponding with the manager. That would be a little dysfunctional. Board to owners, most of the communication between board to owners happens at a meeting, might be an annual meeting, might be a board meeting, but generally most communication happens between the board and the owners at a meeting. And owner to owner, hopefully there's a sense of community in your development that they're able to communicate, chat, interact amongst each other. Sometimes we get questions about, can you send out information about, all the owner's contact information, or can you supply us with an email list? And that information, not without permission, can we share? So meetings, as a board, this is going to be the time period that your meetings are essentially the forum for all of, good majority of the obligations that you have as a board. And so understanding that the purpose of a meeting is to be making decisions. That's where you're setting your policy. That's where you're making your decisions. Your motions are policy. You're approving, if you're approving resolutions, you're setting guidelines, all of that is done in an open meeting. And, the sort of core of that is that you're setting decisions, you're setting policy, and then, informing parties of operational issues. You're going to see our manager's report. You might see maintenance reports. You're going to see staff reports in those meetings that are going to inform the board subcommittees of what's been going on since the last meeting. Some important pieces to that is setting the agenda. As I said, read your board packet. Ask questions before the meeting. This is a really important one because our managers are sending out those board packets 5 to 7 days in advance to give you an opportunity to review it. So if you have questions, we can make sure that we're prepared with the answers to that at the meeting. So if you wait to ask those questions at the meeting, that might stall progress on something. So send those questions to our board, to our managers in advance of the board meeting so that we can gather whatever data might be necessary in order to answer your questions. And, be ready to participate, engage in the discussion, make motions, all of those things, be a part of those meetings as a board member, because that's your opportunity to make sure you're carrying out the things that you haven't contracted away to somebody else. And some tips, on how to address, how to run those meetings. Again, Robert's Rules of Order will send you a really great, simple cheat sheet for that. Understand executive session can only be used for a handful of things. So when we're establishing the agenda for those meetings and what that looks like, your executive session can be used for contract negotiation, legal matters, action against another homeowner, or if you have employees, potentially human resources issues. But how do you address going into executive session? All of those things, tips and tools, we're going to go through that in January in our effective meetings presentation, and how that function of how it's used and how it works. But understand you're somewhat restricted in what you can talk about in executive session. So that kind of extends to on, when you talk about as a board member, what are things that you can discuss with your neighbors? Make sure that you're not talking about anything you're talking about in executive session with any of your, fellow community members, because you have that charge as a board member to make sure that you are protecting that confidentiality. So you will hear us talk about nights and weekends meetings. This is definitely an initiative of our company to make sure that our managers have their balance of work life and that they have an opportunity to be with their families. This is a bit of a stigma in our industry that, sometimes managers would have 5 or 6, sometimes 7 night meetings, throughout a month. And that's sort of extra time because we definitely then, your ownership expects us to be here the next day to take their phone call or answer their emails or things like that. So it doesn't always offset in that way. So we've worked really hard to try and get as many of our meetings as we can into that, 4 o'clock hour or in the afternoons. It's easier now with everything being on Zoom for people to join virtually and not quite as restrictive to come to the office. But we definitely try and avoid those nights and weekend meetings. And then, what are some important things as a volunteer to sort of wrap this up in a bow for you now that we've told you what all of these, what are your obligations and what does the state statute say and how do you carry out the effectiveness of a corporation? And as I said earlier, we don't want to scare anybody. We don't want you to have this perspective that the serving on a board of directors opens you up to personal liability or is such a big job that you don't want to do it. If we had that dynamic, it'd be really hard for us to get volunteers. And so, if the only basic legalese that you take away, this is an important one to understand that you are an unpaid volunteer. And the nonprofit chapter in Oregon says if you are an unpaid volunteer, then the only personal liability that you have is gross negligence or intentional misconduct. So when we tie that back to that business judgment rule we talked about earlier and your fiduciary duty, what that means is that that same reasonableness standard applies. If I make sure as a board member that I listen to my experts, I review the information that's provided to me, and I make the decision that I believe is in the best interest of my community, then you are protected as a board and you are not going to be held personally liable for making a decision that your ownership might not agree with. So, if that's the only thing you take away from today, hopefully there was a lot of other information that you gleaned. But it's important that you understand that all of that obligation shouldn't create concern for you as an individual because there are protections under Chapter 65. So I will, go ahead and if you'd like to ask some questions, if you have some things that you'd like me to clarify, feel free to take yourself off mute, turn on your cameras, and happy to answer your questions.
Okay, this is Bill Anderson. I have a question about this communication among board members.
Yep.
I understand that if we send out an email and it goes to all board members, that's a de facto meeting and that's improper. Mm-hmm. Now, if one board member sends an email to another board member, is that okay? And if that board member then sends a memo to another board member, are we getting into gray area here? Or if you send the string of emails and it eventually covers all board members, are we violating the law or are we just sort of in a gray area?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a gray area. But I will tell you that there is the answer that an attorney is going to give you, and then there's sort of this perspective of what we all have to do to keep business running too. And so you are definitely in a gray area with it, but as long as you're not hitting reply all, the reply all is the issue. Because once you hit reply all and you have all 3, 5, 9, however many board members you have on that email, that from a legal definition is constituted as an open meeting. And so that's the issue, is the reply all. If one board member is emailing another board member, and then that board member is emailing another board member, and you're trying to gain consensus to maybe, move something forward, that happens sometimes in between meetings. We have that one point of contact. So for example, I'll give you a scenario. Our manager, there's a pipe break in your irrigation and it has to be repaired. Our manager is going to reach out to the board president and say, this is what we've done to prevent any future damage to the property, but this is what the repair is going to be. Are you okay moving forward with that? That board president might then go email the other 2 board members and get their approval, and then circle back with the manager and say, go ahead. So there are some ways around it, and there is just some basic functions that we have to keep business rolling for communities, but it's the reply all function that we as management try to educate our boards to avoid.
Okay. And I have one other question about the point of contact with Aperion.
Mm-hmm.
You seem to indicate that everything should go from the president to Aperion. Does that mean any other board members can't contact Aperion if they have a question? Treasurer has a question about finance. Somebody's on a subcommittee for the common area, have got a question. Do they have to send it to the president to send to you, or can they contact you directly?
They can contact our manager directly. Mostly, what this stems around is trying to make sure that the day-to-day functions of driving the community business, sort of sticks with one individual. And where it comes into being a problem, Bill, is, if you had a 5-member board, you might not always have consensus on that. And so as management company, we see like a decision will be made in a board meeting. And then after that board meeting, somebody that doesn't like that decision will reach out. One of the board members doesn't like the decision. They'll reach out to our manager and say, I want you to stop. I want you to not, you can't proceed with this contract. I know the board made that decision, but I'm unhappy about it. And I want to stop this work. And so in that instance, what our manager would do is to say, you need to have this conversation with the president, and then that individual, or the point of contact, whoever that individual. It's not always the president, but sometimes just that's how it winds up being. And so that discussion then happens amongst the board. And when there's a change in direction or how they want that to happen, that point of contact comes back to our manager and says, this is what we've decided. Otherwise, we could potentially get sort of 5 different point of views, and especially on priorities too. If you've got a question, hey, design review committee is meeting next week. Can you answer this, this, and this for me? Yes, 100%. Contact our managers. That's what we're there for. It's more about having one individual giving our manager direction in between board meetings.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Katie, this is Brad. Back to this Oregon open meeting law, and then you got executive sessions. I'm just, I'm currently or going to be the treasurer, but if there's a discussion about budgets, for instance, for the upcoming year, not a decision, but, what do we need to think about budgeting for? We need to think of this, and this, are we going to recommend the following? Mm-hmm. Can that be included in an executive session to do that planning and preparation?
No, that has to be done in an open meeting, because the only way that you'd be able to have that in an executive session is if, for example, you had a question about maybe what your legal authority was, or what your governing documents said around what you could budget for or what you could do. If you were getting advice from your attorney around that, you could potentially have that in an executive session. But anything related to the finances, projects, reserves, budgeting, any of that, there's nothing in the state statutes that allows you to do that in executive session.
Okay, so can I work with the president to about, okay, we need to get ready for the budget. What's the timing of what we're going to do? What are the key drivers or assumptions that in order to prepare this budget so we can bring it to, an open meeting session?
Yes. Yes. And that's generally, that's generally how our managers will carry that out too. If we're doing the first draft of the budget, they're going to send it to the treasurer. Some of our communities, it's the treasurer and the president. There's going to be some dialogue amongst them. If you have 3 members of a board and now there's 2 of you that are dialoguing, that could create some challenges. So it might just be with the president or it might just be with the treasurer. But the goal really is the question you want to ask yourself around this issue is, when will it become a problem? And when would our membership ask questions? And what that generally is if your board comes into a board meeting and you sit down and you've got all of these things on your agenda and there's no discussion, like there's a motion, there's a second, and there's a decision. Right. Your ownership's going to be like, well, where's all the business happening? Like, when are they talking about this stuff? When are they deciding it? And so you just have to think about the perception of how you're conversating about an issue in a board meeting if you're doing pre-work. And feel free to share it with your ownership. If, the board, the treasurer and the president got together, we had these conversations, this was some of the things, like give them the recap of it, but you don't have to rehash the entire conversation. That's completely appropriate.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions? The opens meetings law is always the one thing we get the most questions about, so no worries there.
I will say, Katie, that I've served on a couple of boards for HOAs, and I just recently attended the annual owners meeting where I got volunteered for the board. But but I will say that the kind of what I've seen and the approach that Aperion has, including these kinds of trainings, is the best I've seen so far. So I really appreciate you walking through this. I learned some things that I didn't know before, and I think what you guys are doing are definitely best practices. So
thank you. Yeah, that's definitely our approach. I appreciate that. I'll share that with my team. They'll be glad to hear that.
Yeah, I'll concur in that also.
Any other questions today? Feel free to send me an email or reach out to me too, if you think of something later. We definitely, don't want to create confusion for you. So hopefully this was informative. We will be setting a new training calendar in January for next year. We're going to take December off and hope all of you have a good holiday in the midst of everything that we're all trying to deal with. So whatever that looks like for all of you, we hope that you guys have fantastic Thanksgivings and whatever the Christmas holiday looks like for you guys and your family. We appreciate your guys' business and are, I think, all happy to kind of close out 2020 and see what 2021 has to bring. So thank you guys for your time this afternoon.
All right. Thank you, Katie.
All right.
Have a great day.
Thank you.